Hi, so today I'll be talking about how vision interfaces with high-level cognition, in particular self-representation. And I'll consider the case study of what's called the self-reference effect. Basically, if you associate items with yourself, whatever that is, you perform better for those items, both in perceptual learning and in memory. Now, this implies that there may be some kind of special self-representation that is being associated with the items, thereby leading to the performance benefits. So if this is true, then we should find that this representation is amenable to the kinds of methods that we've used to study other kinds of representations. So here we ask whether there is a capacity limit to it. Specifically, can you have multiple self-representations at once? For instance, if you associate items with different self-concepts like the young you and the old you, or can there only be one self? And if there can be multiple self-representations, then you might expect that people perform even better when there are multiple self-concepts that are being associated with the different items. So there could be like a selves reference effect. Alternatively, if there's only one self-representation, then we should see evidence for this performance limitation. Now I'll look at this in both perceptual matching and long-term memory. So in perceptual matching, we wanted to see whether there is better matching performance for multiple cells versus one. We asked people to associate simple shapes with different labels referring to strangers and selves, and what we varied is how many of those labels, 2 or 1, referred to a self. For instance, one of the labels could be the younger you, the other label the older you, and the third one a stranger. And then in the main trials, we rapidly showed these shapes together with either the correct label or the incorrect one, and people had to rapidly, within a second, say whether the match was correct. Now, what I'm going to plot is the performance for each of the different self conditions. So in the self 1 condition, we presented one self concept with 2 strangers. For instance, the old you and 2 strangers. And as we expected, there was a self-reference boost. Now, for the self-2 condition, we presented the other self-concept, so young you, and again we find this boost. When there are 2 self-concepts, now you perform indistinguishably for the 2, but crucially what we're interested in is whether the summed performance, i.e. the dark red, light red, and green bars, for the 2 selves condition, is higher than the sum performance for the self-1 and self-2 conditions. So that's what I'm depicting here. And as you can see, the third gray bar is not higher than the other 2 gray bars, showing that there is no such boost for 2 selves. Now, we also considered other kinds of self-concepts, like alternative selves in the future, or different parts of yourself that have been studied in philosophy and intuitive psychology. And by and large, we find no evidence for a boost for multiple selves. Now, one possibility is that there might be a boost for multiple selves, provided that those selves are very distinct from each other. So in some follow-up experiments, we looked at this. We measured distinctiveness ratings of different pairs of self-concepts, and we even collected additional performance behavior for other kinds of self-concepts. And by and large, we find no relationship between self-distinctiveness and how much better you perform for 2 cells versus 1. So there's no performance improvement for distinct self-concepts, and the self-reference effect is limited to 1 self. Now, what about long-term memory, which is a less active kind of representation? Well, once again, we employed a similar approach, but now we asked people to imagine that the different self-concepts are in a supermarket. Then we told them that each of the self-concepts won a given item. So for instance, the young you won this toy soldier, and then we asked people, do you think this person liked the item? Causing them to encode the item, hopefully with respect to this self-context. And then later on, in a surprise recall test, we asked people to say who won each of the items. Now, once again, you can see that by and large, we find evidence for a self-reference effect. In one of the cases, it's trending, and in the other one, numerically, it's going in the right direction. When there were 2 self-concepts in the same paradigm, we find mostly indistinguishable performance for the 2 selves, although interestingly, people do still perform better for the true versus surface self, and we have some independent work suggesting that the true self is particularly important in terms of personal identity. But crucially, at least in 2 out of 3 of the experiments, people perform no better for 2 cells versus 1. Now, of course, here we do see an exception in experiment 1, where they do perform better for 2 cells versus 1. So what's going on here? Well, once again, we thought, okay, maybe it might be that distinctiveness matters, maybe at least in long-term memory. And indeed it does. So as it happens, the past and future selves are particularly distinct self-concepts, and more generally, the more distinct self-concepts you're dealing with, the better you perform in long-term memory. So the self-reference effect is limited to one self, otherwise we would have seen this performance benefit across all of the different experiments. But it seems you do get this additional boost if the self-concepts are distinct. And this effect of conceptual distinctiveness has been demonstrated for long-term memory previously, so it's probably not specific to self-processing per se. So in sum, there's a self-reference effect. It's limited to one self-concept at a time, but you can remember more information if the different self-concepts are distinct. With that, I'd like to thank my co-authors.